So hello guys. As you're already aware, we have a 2-hour webinar today in English about a Zabbix, so about a monitoring. And to be more specific, we're going to talk about Zabbix performance tuning. And the things are as usual in a webinar, like your microphones are muted, not to make all sort of noise around here. You can ask your questions in a Q&A section, which is like nothing new for the webinars. I'm probably not going to be able to answer them like during the topics that we're going to cover in the presentation, but we'll have a Q&A session in the end so we can talk through all of that stuff. And feel free to use chat to talk with each other, networking, sharing some experience with a Zabbix, and maybe asking also some questions to each other and so on and so on. But let me try to clear up a little bit my screen. Before we begin, I think it does make sense to get to know me better because some of you maybe don't even have an idea who I am. So, my name is Dmitry, and I believe most of you who know me because of all sort of random YouTube videos about the Zabbix and the monitoring. And right before this webinar, we talked that hey, we actually have 135, I think it was 135 videos about a Zabbix that I made think across like 7 years. So there's quite a lot of experience shared about monitoring, about a Zabbix, different tutorials, fixes, how to fix stuff, how to monitor stuff, and so on. And on top of that, I come to work in a Zabbix for 9 years. So I started as a support engineer, slowly became a trainer, consultant, traveled quite a lot, did a lot of turnkey solutions for customers in all sort of different fields. Then basically became head of the support, and then head of the product was also very closely related to launch of the Zabbix Cloud. So I think we can surely say that I do know something about a Zabbix and about the monitoring. And that's the main goal here, like to share some of that knowledge and experience with you guys. And I don't like I don't even know how to better explain that. There are some type of the webinars where we go like super deep, technical in detail so that most of the people have even trouble to understand what we're even talking about. I want this conversation to be more like on the human language so that all of you understand what we're talking about. We're going to 100% cover the problems and some issues that you might have experienced in your monitoring journey and journey with a Zabbix. And I'm going to also share some ways how we can fix that. So for the topic of Zabbix performance tuning and Zabbix performance monitoring and having a Zabbix performance issues, I think like one of the core principles that we need to understand about a Zabbix is how does it really work? What kind of components we have? And this thing is like is version agnostic. It really doesn't matter if you have version Zabbix 7.0 or 6.0 or let me move the poll away, or maybe 7.4, it doesn't really make the difference because the concepts actually remain very much similar. And if we talk about the data flow inside the Zabbix, there's always some data collection part. And in a nutshell, it really doesn't matter that much if we're talking about a Zabbix agents that we're installing on a server where maybe we're monitoring some network stuff through the SNMP v1, v2, or 3. Maybe we're collecting some SNMP traps or monitoring database or so on. Nevertheless, all of that is data collection that we can see on the slide, and essentially all of the data travels to the Zabbix server. We could also put here Zabbix proxy as gateway that serves between the server and the data collection. But here right now we're looking on a Zabbix server, and a Zabbix server is like a brain of your whole monitoring setup, which is responsible to collect the data, analyze the data, process the data, analyze the triggers that you have configured, and also send you notifications. And right now, Zabbix has grown like tremendously because a couple of years ago, there were not so many options out of the box how you could get your notifications. But right now it's very flexible. Like getting something in an email, it's like meh, not very trending anymore. You can receive your alerts in Slack, Teams, Discord, Telegram, WhatsApp. You can integrate Zabbix with the ticketing systems and create some tickets for your support team and so on and so on. And I always say that like monitoring basically can be divided in three parts. There's data collection, data processing, and a visualization, because data is everything. Like it's super important to collect the data. It's super important to treat the data right and analyze it, which means that it would be just a very big mistake to throw the data out, right? If we collect something collected by the Zabbix server, process with the trigger, send notification, throw it out. That would be a big mistake. We still want to see things on the graphs. That's why we have a database where all of the historical data is stored, and that one is used for the front end, which is like the first screen for the human interaction, where you can visualize all of your collected data, check your dashboards, graphs, widgets, reports, and also configure stuff. Like the good thing about Zabbix is whenever you need to add something new, you don't really need to go in the black terminal screen typing in some commands. You have quite a beautiful front end where you are able to set everything up, right? Um, how to measure performance. Also important and very interesting topic, because I have traveled quite a lot, different again customers, trainings, and conferences about the monitoring. And when you meet some people who are also close with the Zabbix and using it for some monitoring, it's always interesting to know like how big is their environment, because as you use Zabbix, as you grow, you always notice that you're starting to struggle with some performance issues, and then you find the ways how to solve them, and you see in the forums and in the Reddit and so on that there are some other people who are struggling as well. So it's like always interesting. Okay, how is this guy doing? And very often we ask like, how big is your Zabbix? And for those who are really aware of how Zabbix work, we ask like, how big is your NVPS? And to people who are talking, we're like, what do you mean? Like, well, new values per second, because we want to know how big is their instance. And the reality is that this NVPS, new values per second, is the only number within the Zabbix that will tell you how big is your Zabbix installation. Many people like to say like, well, we have 1,500 hosts, right? Like, cool, you might have 50,000 hosts or 500,000 hosts. Reality is that it doesn't really mean so much. So why the number of devices is not an indicator? Because the size of the Zabbix is measured on how much new values we are receiving, and the number of hosts doesn't really give us that metric that we're looking for. That metric is calculated through the number of hosts, then like number of items, and update intervals of each of those items. And that gives us NVPS, which is the new values per second. So, which is also visible here on the in the reports system information. Let me try to change my screen here a bit. Give me a second. Six and Zabbix. There you go. Let me minimize this a little bit. Yeah, so this would be the typical Zabbix 7.0 that I just installed before the webinar. And usually you can see that stuff in the dashboard. Like that's the default dashboard of the Zabbix after installation, where you can see like all sort of the problems, and also system information, where you have this required server performance, new values per second. Sometimes you have this dashboard deleted because someone decided, okay, we don't need this default stuff from the Zabbix. We're going to build our own dashboards. And then when someone says like, tell me your NVPS, where can I get it in a dashboard? Like, I don't have it. Well, then you can always go to reports and system information. Like this is the page where you will see only this information. But the thing is that the stuff that we see here, required server performance, new values per second, is also not entirely true, because This one, data types, Zabbix Trapper or SNMP Trap are not taken into account because like everything that we can see here required server performance new values per second. This is purely calculation of update intervals that we have on our items. So just the calculation of the database stuff, right? And if we talk about SNMP traps, do we know how much traps we're gonna receive by these items in next hour? No, we don't. That's why usually these metrics are just ignored. Same stuff goes for the log monitoring, and usually like this is very much rough calculation of what's the actual NVPS for your Zabbix server, and it's gonna differ from the actual numbers. And also the important thing is that here it's gonna stay static. Like you will come in the morning, it's gonna be 74.98. You're gonna come in the evening, it's gonna be same values. So usually, like if you are looking for the real data, it's worth to check Zabbix server health dashboard, which comes again built-in dashboard, which comes from the built-in host Zabbix server, which has like official Zabbix server health template attached to it. And that one has a widget and also the item that you can just check the latest data, values processed per second. So as you can see, like the lowest one, this one, number of processed values per second is 2 values per second. And despite of a fact that in the reports, we can see that it should be 2.41. So on a clean installation, it might not be such a big difference. But nevertheless, like this is the place where you can see actual value of new values per second processed by your Zabbix server. And why update frequency greatly affects NVPS? Well, I think it's like straightforward. As I said, we're basically interested in the amount of the items and update intervals, and from that we can calculate the actual NVPS. Yeah. So let's move on. This is another example screenshot of the real installation in the production of how Zabbix can perform 38,000. It's actually quite a lot. So as I said, I worked 9 years in a Zabbix, and trust me, I've seen quite a lot of all sort of different installations of the Zabbix, and 38 is a lot. It's not like a maximum. I've seen also 100 plus, but usually like 10 is already good. Everything above 10, you already should pretty much know what you are doing to make sure that everything is going to be fine. So these are pretty much impressive numbers. But it's also important to understand like Zabbix gets better not only visually, but also internally. So each new version has some performance tuning into the code. Features run more optimized way, and you can get much better results with the same configuration and the same hardware. And talking about the hardware, like here is just some example: 10 core CPU, 64 gigs of the memory, NVMe SSDs. And by the way, we're going to talk about the storage a bit later, but storage is something that should not be overlooked. Of course, for the database, it's super important. And if you have that large installation of the Zabbix, it's very important to also have a good storage available and make sure that it's not going to be the root cause of your performance issues. Budget 4K euros. Zabbix can deliver 2.7 million of values per minute, or around 45,000 of values per second. In real life, performance would be worse. Why? And this slide, I think, it comes from the Zabbix training. And again, this is some concept that hasn't really changed over the last years. There won't be any installation that is going to work the same in two different places. I've often seen that many times people ask like, hey, can you share your Zabbix server configuration file? Can you share your database configuration file? Because we have quite a similar specs of the hardware. So I just, your runs fine. Let me apply it to mine and hope everything's going to be good. But it's not a reality. Reality is that every setup is going to be different because all sort of small nuances. You need to take in account everything. Like, let's say monitoring Linux CPU load on the system, which is on a local host, it's going to take 0.00 something seconds to get your CPU load data. So the Polar connects, gets the data, you have it in a Zabbix server, processed, visible in your widgets, everyone are happy. In some remote locations, maybe you're monitoring the CPU load on some big ship that is sailing in a sea and it's running through the proxy and through the satellite internet and so on and so on. It might take like 2 seconds. And imagine like in those 2 second times, how much CPU load metrics we could get from the local computer that sits next to us. It's like network is one of the things, just a speed of the checks, speed of the triggers, expressions of the triggers that you use. As example, checking just the last value of the item is going to be much more easier for the performance rather than checking some average value in the last 2 hours. So there's no system is going to be the same. In real life, we are always going to have something that is going to slow us down. So, in a nutshell, like what affects performance? Like, what are those key ingredients and key principles that make our Zabbix and monitoring slower? Type of items, as example, again, Zabbix agent checks are probably the easiest ones. Maybe like simple checks could be faster, the ones that are executed by the Zabbix server, and we basically can get just ICMP stuff like ICMP ping. That's quick. That's quick. If network is fast, everything is going to be fine. Value types, again, working with the numbers is going to be faster than working with a text. And like not only working with it, one thing is analyzing triggers and analyzing data overall. Second thing is like living with that data, keeping a 3 months of the history of some CPU load item that receives like 2 digits is one thing. And when you have items that are receiving some JSON output out of your MySQL or something else that's like 500 kilobytes or something like that, and you are monitoring and polling that every 5 seconds and storing in your database, and that's in template, and you have 500 MySQL servers, that's something completely else. SNMP 3, everything that's kind of has encryption is going to be slower that doesn't, right? There is a cost for security and making sure that your data is not going to be spoofed on the way. Number of triggers. Triggers are actually people used to think like, okay, we have so many items, we have so many NVPS. That's why our system is big. That's why we're having the performance. Usually, like in most of the cases, performance is affected by the triggers, not by the items. Like you could have some very large installation, as we saw previously, 45K and VPS. And let's say one beautiful day we start to experience performance problems, turn off the triggers. You can do that through the database. Like you need to run a query basically to disable all of the triggers. If you're trying to do that, I'm not going to give you like a SQL command right now, but basically, instead of disabling them, all of them, don't do that because when you're going to need to enable them back, you will not know which ones were actually disabled before you run that command. So instead, I would suggest to create a dummy table in the database, copy paste, just insert your existing triggers table to that dummy table. Then you can disable your real table. And when your test is over, then just grab the previous like backup of the triggers data to revert all the changes. But you will see that like turning off the triggers basically makes your Zabbix fly, right? Because there's no load, no data processing. Housekeeper settings and thus the size of the database. We'll get also to the housekeeper, but the important thing is housekeeper is bad. If someone is telling you something else, I don't know. Well, I could find imagine some cases where I would say, like, okay, go with a housekeeper. If someone says, like, I have 5 computers and I need to monitor them and I don't care so much about a history, fine, go with a housekeeper. If that's a production environment, partitioning, one and only, and right at the start of your Zabbix installation. In those 9 years in the Zabbix, I think there was no turnkey for a customer where it was planned to start a setup with housekeeper. Always partitioning right from the start because the thing is, the longer you live with a housekeeper, eventually you will get to the point that you need partitioning, and the later it happens, the more complicated it is to switch to partitioning. It's much easier to do that right in the beginning from the clean database. Number of users working with the web interface. Also a big issue. In the latest versions, there were some improvements, especially in the permissions checks, but basically a common thing for large installations, let's say some Mondays, 9 a.m. when people come and start to view some dashboards and reports and data inside the Zabbix, people start to notice that, hey, my front end is starting to get sluggish and some page takes like 10 seconds or whatever to open. That's a good reason for a slow Zabbix. Speed of data gathering, so network, as I said, disk performance for Zabbix database, also mentioned old versions and untuned environments. Um, Probably one of the most common mistakes, actually, why there are Zabbix performance untuned environments, just default configuration files, especially for the database. And the interesting thing about database tuning is that you can add just like 6 configuration parameters and it's going to increase your performance 5 times. You don't really need to have like 20, 25 because really those 5 ones were going to give the tremendous boost in the performance. And then the other 20 are going to be like min-maxing and gaining like 5 to 10% of the performance. But if you don't do that at all, then your database is just unable to utilize resources of your server. And sometimes people think like, okay, our database is sluggish. I've seen myself some cases where the user has like around 100 something NVPS, everything is slow queries, and they say like, yeah, so it's not working. And last week we added a memory, and right now it has 32 gigs of RAM, but it's still slow. Default configuration file. You have 32 gigs of RAM, but database is using just like 200 megs, and that's it. Um, Old versions, always try to keep up to date. I know that major version upgrades may seem scary and not everyone want to do that, but at least minor versions are usually harmless. And also many times, like right now, the latest 7.0 version, I think is 7.025, something like that. I've very often seen cases when someone is complaining that something is not working, and even being so late in the life cycles, they still might be running some 7.0.0 beta, something like that. So try to keep your minor versions up. API requests, scripts, Grafana, history push. Believe it or not, people do love Grafana. It's good, don't get me wrong. In a version Zabbix 3.0 or something like that, it was hard to imagine a Zabbix installation without a Grafana because the visualization options in the Zabbix itself were more on a sad side. Right now, it's quite even and you can get amazing stuff in a Zabbix itself, but Grafana can bug down your performance. So can scripts, so can API requests that are implemented in some scripts. That's why you always need to be careful on what kind of permissions, API tokens you give out, because you're not protected from someone who will just vibe code some script to pull in 1 month worth of the history from your Zabbix and do that like every 2 minutes, you will definitely feel that in your Zabbix performance. And it's going to be quite hard to find out what it actually is, what is causing it. So be careful with that. And encryption, as I mentioned, like there is a price for security. I'm talking about monitoring types with encryption. I'm talking about front-end encryption to the database. I'm talking about server encryption to the database, encryption between server and proxy, server and agent. There is a performance effect from that. Sometimes it's worth it. I probably would not recommend like to encrypt absolutely everything, all of your agent communications, all of your proxies, all. No, but sometimes we do have those sensitive endpoints that we want to have extra security on. Then sure, let's go encryption. Some examples: 60 items per host. So try it again at this slide. 60 items per host. So 60 items. Update frequency once per minute, so every 60 seconds. And the reality is that if we have 100 of hosts with such setup, we have 100 NVPS, 10,000, 10,000. But if we have 300 items per host, update frequency once per minute, then these numbers change like drastically. 100 items are already 500 NVPS, 1,000 items, 5,000 NVPS, and so on. So choose the update frequency and duration of storage carefully. Um, Again, slow versus fast, like in a Zabbix itself, large database is going to be always slower, like no matter what. That's why sometimes again, like from experience, sometimes people come and say like, okay, we need Zabbix. We want to monitor what you need to monitor. Well, everything. What is everything? Well, we have like, I don't know, stores all across of the United States, and we need to collect all of that data. We need to collect bank terminals and some software, computer data, and so on and so on and so on. Like, okay, that's not a problem. We calculate everything and say that's going to be something around like 15,000 NVPS, which is a good number, not causing any major problems. And the other important question is like, how much do you need to store the database, the history? Because it's important to know that to also suggest to the customer or potential customer, like what kind of storage they need to choose and to make sure that they also understand what will be the expenses for the setup. And this one is tricky because uh, it's very important to deliver correct message as someone who knows Zabbix, because asking how long do you want to keep a history, manager is going to say like 5 years. Let's go. Why not? And if we think about like 15,000 NVPS and 5 years, there are online database sizing calculators. I'll show you at the end of the presentation. Trust me, it's a lot. It's very a lot. And if we take that large database into account and we say like how much you're going to pay for the storage, is just crazy amount. And very often people will say like, no, we just apparently we cannot afford Zabbix. But instead, what people should say like, okay, you need 5 years of the history. So let me tell you, we have such thing as a trends, and the trend is aggregation of 1 hour history, which keeps minimal, maximal, and average value for that 1 hour period. That you can keep for 5 years, but let's keep the raw history for like 3 months, and you will save like 70 or 80% of your expenses. Your Zabbix will be much easier to handle, and basically everyone are going to be just much more happier. Low level detection, update frequency, 30 seconds, 15 minutes, 30 minutes are slow, and update frequency 1 hour, 1 day, 7 day fast. I think the biggest problem is with low update intervals. If we talk about 30 seconds, and sometimes we can see even 20, 10, 1 second that someone forgot to change after testing out some templates, because low-level discovery essentially gathers a huge load of JSON data for the Zabbix server and then processes that data, and based on the received content, creates items, creates hosts, creates triggers. All of that calculation takes a lot of resources and also time, relatively a lot of time. We're not talking about minutes, of course, but as I said, like the fast things are happening in 0.00 seconds. Slow things could run like 5 seconds, 10, 15. That's very slow already. And when we talk about low level discovery, we usually don't expect things to change so fast, right? Things usually change much slower, so there's no necessity to run a discovery every single second. Better to do that like once a day or something like that. Errors in the settings like no data and multiple event generation. Multiple event generation is a huge problem in a Zabbix, and I think it still is and will be until we're going to have a problem event correlation engine, which right now is promised for the Zabbix 8.0, because sometimes the things that we monitor don't really have recovery operations, like something with the logs. It's written only when the problem happens. It doesn't write anything when it recovers. So we basically need to turn on multiple event generation and trigger every time when the problem happens, when the log appears. But if there's something goes south in your installation and suddenly you receive like 1,000 log lines, well then it's a big mess and you have a storm of alerts. The dashboards are pretty nasty and the problems page as well. No data, 5 minutes, like fast, trigger expression, minimal, maximal, average, slower. The most important thing here is definitely like time period. 5 minutes will not going to be so dramatic, but if you want to analyze like maximal of the week, it's definitely going to be slow. So last is super efficient. Just one value comes in, compare with the trigger expression, true, false, no, move on. But can it always provide us what we need? Probably not. Last value might be just one hiccup in the data, doesn't necessarily means that we need to alert someone or create a problem. So usually we need to take into account at least multiple data sets to determine that the problem happened. Data collection, polling is slow, trapping is fast.